I was born into silence, not the kind that soothes, not the hush of morning before the birds sing, but a silence heavy with chains, overseers, and the unspoken truth that my life did not belong to me. On the Mississippi plantation where I drew my first breath, the earth itself seemed tired of bearing witness. Every step in the fields echoed with generations who had bled before me. Their cries hung in the air invisible, but I could hear them, always. The mistress of the house liked to say we were lucky to be clothed, fed, and housed under her roof. Her voice was sweet when visitors came, dripping honey, her skirts trailing across the polished floors of the great house. But I knew the venom beneath her tongue. To us, her sweetness turned to acid, her hands quick to strike. Her punishment sharpened to humiliate, not just harm. She delighted in making the air itself choke us with fear. I grew up knowing her smile was deadlier than her frown. My name is Rosa. I was small for my age, sharp-eyed and quiet, and those who survived long enough learned that silence was often the best defense. Silence let you watch without being seen. It let you keep your thoughts hidden while others revealed theirs too freely. I wore silence like armor. But deep inside, beneath the quiet, something restless stirred. A knowledge that silence could also become a weapon. One day, that weapon would be mine. Plantation was a world unto itself, cut off from mercy. The fields stretched wide, endless seas of cotton shimmering under the punishing sun. Overseers rode their horses between the rows, whips dangling like serpents ready to strike. Men and women bent their backs until their bones ached. Children ran barefoot carrying water. Elders were forced to labor long past their strength. We weren't people to them. We were tools, flesh-bound to land. And our voices didn't carry beyond the fences that caged us in. But I had another world too. A world hidden beneath the one my mistress ruled. At night, when the air cooled, and the stars pierced the dark, whispers passed among us. Songs not meant for white ears, words in broken tongues stitched from Africa to America. My grandmother, long gone before I reached womanhood, had been the keeper of these whispers. She told me stories in hushed tones, stories about power that lived in the earth, in the roots, in blood, in the wind that carried the names of our ancestors. I was little then, but I listened as if my survival depended on it, because maybe it did. By day I was Rosa, the obedient servant. By night I was Rosa, the student of shadows. I learned that every plant growing wild had a spirit. Some healed, some protected, and some could bind and break. I learned to grind herbs into powders that soothed pain or stirred strange dreams. I learned that salt could guard a doorway, and that a circle drawn in ash could keep away spirits, or trap them if one was brave enough. These were dangerous lessons, but in a world where my body belonged to another, knowledge was the only thing that was truly mine. The mistress never suspected. To her, I was no more than a piece of furniture, something to command, to scold, to strike. She thought she owned me, body and soul, but she never saw what I carried in my silence. She never knew that the same hands that scrubbed her floors and carried her tea also held the memory of rituals older than this land. She never noticed the way I studied her, the way I stored her cruelty in my chest like kindling waiting for a spark. The first time I considered vengeance, it came not in rage but in clarity. She had punished me that day, humiliating me in front of the others, forcing me to kneel in the dirt while she mocked my skin, my blood, my very existence. I kept my head bowed, but inside I was standing tall, remembering my grandmother's voice. Blood is power, child. Blood carries more than life. It carries consequence. That night I lay awake on the hard ground, staring at the rafters above me. Every strike of her words replayed in my mind, but instead of pain I felt something else, a sharpening, a purpose forming like a blade being drawn. For the first time, silence no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a hammer waiting to fall. I began to notice things differently after that. The way the mistress's hands trembled when she wrote letters late at night. The way her face flushed with rage when things did not go her way. The way her kin visited less and less, as though the house itself carried a sickness they dared not catch. These were cracks in her armor, and cracks could be widened. But I was patient. Patience was survival, and I had learned to survive since the day I was born. I kept working, kept bowing, kept hiding my eyes. I kept my silence. She thought she had broken me, but the truth was the opposite. She had sharpened me. And in the quiet of my thoughts, I began to plan. I knew there would be no forgiveness for me if I was caught. My body would not survive the punishments that followed. But my soul, it hungered for freedom, for justice that no overseer's whip could deny me. The ancestors stirred in my dreams, their whispers threading through the dark. Sometimes I woke with tears on my cheeks. unsure if they were warning me or urging me forward. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps vengeance and destruction walked hand in hand, and I had to decide whether I was willing to hold them both. Each morning I rose before the mistress, preparing her house as though nothing had changed. I carried her meals, washed her linens, endured her words. But in the stillness of night, when the air smelled of damp soil and pine, I practiced the chants I half remembered. My voice quivered, but each night it grew steadier. I touched the earth, feeling for the roots that my grandmother once told me about. Roots that grew only in places where blood had seeped into the ground. Roots that remembered. The chains around my wrists and ankles were real, yes. But they were not the only chains I wore. There were chains on my spirit, chains forged of fear and silence. But I was beginning to see that chains could be broken, and sometimes they could be turned into weapons. The mistress didn't know it yet, but her bloodline had already begun to tremble, because I had made my choice, and once chosen there would be no turning back. The older I grew, the more I realized that silence carried echoes. At night, when the others lay restless in their sleep, I could hear them. The whispers of those who came before me. They slid between the walls of the cabins, curled up in the corners where candlelight couldn't reach. They spoke not in words I could always understand, but in rhythms, pulses, fragments of songs. My grandmother had told me once that the dead never truly left us. They clung to blood, to memory, to earth. If we listened carefully enough, we would hear them calling. My grandmother, Adeline, had been the first voice to open that world to me. She was not tall, not strong in body, but her presence filled a room like smoke. She carried herself as though she knew secrets too heavy for others to bear, and she passed some of those secrets to me in whispers when no one else was near. Even as a child, I knew what she gave me was dangerous, something not to be spoken aloud, not to be shared freely. Rosa, she would say, her voice low and steady, never forget that the world you see with your eyes is only half of what's there. The rest, child, you must feel with your skin, with your bone. She would place my little hand on the ground, pressing it into the dirt until I swore I could feel the heartbeat of the earth itself. That is where the truth lies, she said. Not in their words, not in their words. Here, always here. I didn't understand it all then, but her lessons sank into me like water into thirsty soil. She taught me to watch the way smoke curled upward from a fire. Whether it bent left or right, steady or broken, it meant something. She showed me which roots could soothe the fever that came with the damp winters, and which ones could sour the stomach of a cruel overseer if slipped into his drink. She explained that every living thing carried spirit. The vines that twisted up the fence posts, the bones of animals buried deep in the fields, even the wind that wailed at night like a mourning woman. Some spirits could be asked for help. Others had to be forced. And still others. Well, some spirits demanded a price no one should be willing to pay. Blood, she told me once, her eyes catching the moonlight through the cracks in the cabin wall. Blood is the strongest bond there is, stronger than chains, stronger than fire, stronger than fire. With blood, a curse can stretch across oceans, across generations. But remember, child, blood remembers who called it. It comes back to collect. At the time I shivered at her words, not from cold but from the weight of them. I had seen her work before, though never spoke of it. A poultice she made for a woman writhing in childbirth saved both mother and child when all hope had seemed lost. A small pouch of herbs tied around the neck of a boy kept his fever from returning when nothing else would. And once, though this she never admitted, I saw her bury something beneath the steps of the overseer's cabin after he had beaten a man nearly to death. Not a week later, the overseer fell sick with pains that twisted him in half, and he limped for the rest of his life. My grandmother said nothing, but when her eyes met mine, I understood. Power had answered her call. When she passed, the plantation grew colder, not just from her absence, but because I felt the burden of silence heavier than ever. I was only a girl, too young to hold all she had given me, yet too bound to it to let it go. In my dreams, she still came. She would stand at the edge of a field, her face half in shadow, her voice low. Remember what I told you, she would whisper. Remember, Rosa, remember, Rosa. They may own your body, but never your soul. As I grew into womanhood, the whispers of the ancestors grew louder. Sometimes it was a song sung under breath by the elders while we worked, words I didn't recognize but felt deep in my chest. Sometimes it was the sharp cry of a crow, perched on the roof of the great house, echoing like a warning. And sometimes it was in the moments when the mistress punished me, when rage and humiliation burned hot inside me. Then, the whispers curled tighter, hissing through my veins like fire. They told me I did not have to bear it. They told me I had tools she could never understand. Still, I was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if I dared to call on them. Afraid of what price they might demand. My grandmother had warned me, spirits could heal, yes, but they could also destroy. They could make a life bloom or shrivel it to dust. They could take your enemies, but they could also take you. You must be certain, she had said. When you call, there is no going back. And yet each cruelty from my mistress pressed me closer to that edge. Each lash of her tongue, each strike of her hand, each humiliation before others, it was as if the ancestors whispered louder with every wound. Their voices began to overlap, a chorus of the dead urging me to remember what blood could do. I began to wonder if it wasn't fear I felt, but inevitability. The other slaves sometimes came to me quietly, seeking remedies I had learned from Adeline. A crushed leaf for swelling, a powder to mix with water for aching bones. They trusted me, though we never spoke openly of what I knew. To speak it aloud would draw the wrong ears, and the mistress would see to it that I was silenced forever. Still, in those moments of helping others, I felt the presence of my grandmother strongest, as if she stood behind me, guiding my hands. I began to keep small tokens hidden away. A feather plucked from a blackbird, a shard of bone unearthed near the edge of the field, strands of hair, threads of cloth, things most would overlook. To me, they were pieces of the hidden world, puzzle fragments waiting to be assembled. I didn't know then exactly what shape they would take, only that they were mine to hold, mine to wield if I dared. One night, as the moon hung swollen and bright, I dreamt of my grandmother again. She stood in the doorway of the great house. I woke trembling, the sound of her voice still in my ears, the sheets damp with sweat. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that her dream visit was not just memory, but a warning and a promise. The ancestors were not just watching me, they were waiting. And I began to realize, with a chill that wrapped around my bones, that one day I would have to answer them. Cruelty wears many faces. Some strike with fists, others with words. My mistress preferred both, wielding them like twin blades she never tired of sharpening. To those who visited the plantation, she smiled with the softness of lace and perfume. Her voice was sweet as sugar syrup, her hands gentle as she poured tea into porcelain cups. But the moment the guests left, the mask slid away, and what remained was venom wrapped in silk. From the first day I could remember her, she looked at me not as a person, not even as a servant, but as a thing she owned. Her eyes, blue like a winter sky, sharp as glass, followed me constantly, waiting for the smallest mistake. A crease in her gown not smoothed quickly enough, a glass of water poured an inch too full, a thread missed in the hem of her dress. Each error, no matter how slight, became fuel for her fury. She never struck out of necessity, only out of desire. She wanted to remind me, again and again, that I was beneath her, body and soul. At first it was the slap of her hand across my cheek, sudden and sharp. But over time, her punishments grew into performances. She wanted witnesses, other slaves visiting neighbors, even her own children. She wanted them to see her power, to see me crumble under it. The sting of her palm became the bite of switches across my back, the crack of wooden spoons, the burn of hot water spilled accidentally across my hands as I worked. She would smile while I bit down my screams, her lips curling like a cat toying with a mouse. The worst of it wasn't the pain, though. It was the humiliation. She would make me kneel before her in the drawing room, scrubbing floors already clean, while she laughed with her friends. Sometimes she forced me to stand still for hours, holding a tray of cups until my arms shook so violently the porcelain rattled. If I faltered, she'd spill the tea down the front of my dress and call me clumsy, lazy, ungrateful. Her words cut deeper than any lash, stripping me bare in front of others. Each insult lodged itself in my chest, heavy as stone. She loved to remind me of my place. "You'll never be more than what I make you," she hissed once, leaning close so no one else could hear. Her perfume clung to me, sweet and suffocating. "You think you've got secrets, don't you? I can see it in your eyes. But secrets won't save you. You belong to me, Rosa, body and breath." Those words should have broken me, and yet in her cruelty, she only fed something she could not see. For every strike, I remembered my grandmother's whisper. For every insult, the ancestors' voices grew loud. When my mistress sneered that I was nothing, a hollow thing, I felt the fire in my blood flare hotter, as if the dead themselves rose in defiance inside me. She thought she was pressing me down, grinding me into dust. She did not know she was hardening me into stone. The turning point came one humid afternoon in late summer. The air hung thick with heat, the cicadas screaming in the trees. I had been tasked with mending one of her gowns. A pale dress trimmed with lace delicate as spiderwebs. My fingers worked carefully, though the thread cut into my skin. I finished just as she entered the room, her eyes sweeping over the dress. At first she said nothing, only stared. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she ripped the seam apart, fabric tearing like flesh. "Do it again," she snapped. "You call this work? My children could do better blindfolded." I tried to explain softly that I had followed every stitch as she asked. My words barely left my mouth before her hand struck me, harder than ever before. The taste of iron filled my mouth, warm and metallic. She struck again until I stumbled backward against the wall, the world spinning. I caught myself before I fell, though my knees trembled. She smiled then, not with joy but with satisfaction. She wanted me broken, crawling at her feet. And when I refused, when I stood tall despite the blood at my lip, her eyes narrowed into slits. For the first time I saw something flicker across her face that looked like fear. Just for a heartbeat. Then it was gone, replaced by fury. That night I lay in my cot, every bruise throbbing. The whispers pressed in closer than ever, humming like bees inside my skull. I could almost feel my grandmother's hand stroking my hair, her voice curling around me. "Blood remembers, blood bind." I clutched the hem of my blanket, my nails digging into the fabric, and I knew then that a line had been crossed. My mistress's cruelty was no longer bearable. No prayer, no patience, no submission could protect me from her. If I wanted peace, I would have to take it. If I wanted freedom, I would have to carve it with my own hands. Her children began to fear her temper too, I noticed. I watched from the shadows as she scolded them with the same venom she poured onto me. They flinched at her voice, avoided her touch. Even in her own house, she sowed fear like seeds in a field, and it grew wild around her. She thought herself untouchable, the mistress of all she surveyed. But I knew better. Power like hers was fragile. It cracked when pressed too hard, and I was ready to press. It was no longer about surviving. Survival had kept me quiet all these years, had bent my spine under her hand. But what good was survival if it meant living in her shadow forever? No, I wanted more than to live. I wanted her to feel the weight she had placed on me, the terror she had fed me day after day. I wanted her to taste despair, to choke on it until she understood what it meant to be powerless. That was the night I decided. My grandmother's teachings would not remain whispers in the dark any longer. The spirits had waited, patient and silent, for me to answer. Now I would. My mistress believed I belonged to her, but she was wrong. I belonged to the ancestors, to the blood that called across generations. And with their help I would show her that cruelty always has a price. There was a practical side to the magic my grandmother taught me. Rituals that demanded patience, timing, and an object that carried a piece of the person you intended to bind or unbind. She called it a link. I would learn later that some called it a token, some called it a 13th ingredient, but Adeline always spoke plainly. If you want the world to answer, you must give it something it can hold. For lovers it might be a ribbon, for bargains a coin, and for curses that reached into a family line, blood was the strongest key. At first the thought of taking blood from the mistress felt impossible. To steal such a thing from a woman who moved through the house like a goddess would have been suicide on its own. But grief hardens the hands and clarifies the mind. Isaiah's sale had turned the small, secret place inside me into a well of flames. I could not imagine the taste of mourning without him. The image of his chained form haunted me. The way his head had bloodied where they'd struck him. The way his hands had trembled when they loaded him into the wagon. That blood, that memory, lodged itself somewhere stubborn and hot. It would become the hinge on which the rest of my life swung. I began to watch her more closely, learning habits no one else saw. The mistress had a nightly routine, a cup of wine at the foot of her bed, a lock of hair she tucked into a locket when she thought herself alone, the soft rasp of her breath as she read by lamplight. She thought herself private above scrutiny. She didn't count on the patience of someone who survived on watching. The opportunity arrived with the small cruelty of a careless guest. Mrs. Langley, a widow from over the river, had come for a sewing circle. The tea had flowed, the gossip had been sharp, and the mistress, in a mood of flattered generosity, had perched by the parlor window to show off a new brooch, a silver thing set with some pale stone that caught the light like a trapped moon. She had taken it off at one point, complaining of a scratch at her neck. She loosened the clasp to rub at the irritation and set the brooch on the table, leaving her throat exposed. A foolish moment, a beautiful one. I waited until the guests drifted into the music room. The children were sent upstairs with candies, the men into the study to smoke and argue about crops. The house for a few minutes was a breathing thing without vigilance. I moved like a shadow, there and then not there, the skill of a dozen years of service. I bypassed the parlor, dipped into the closet where extra linens were hung, and found what I needed. A needle, a scrap of her lace that had fallen from a hem earlier in the day, and a strip of fine cloth I'd saved for mending. The trick of stealing a woman's blood is less about force than finesse. It is about being close enough to touch, and quiet enough not to be noticed. When I reached her side, she was laughing at some private joke, the brooch lying like a tiny sun on the table. Her throat shone where the light met the skin, soft pale, a place that had never known pain from hands like ours. For a moment, my heart tried to convince me to turn away. The house had rules, and the rules were backed by more than threats, but grief pushes you past fear. I pressed my fingers to the hollow at the base of her throat, as if checking for a pulse, and palmed the needle between my fingers. I did not think of the sin, or the law, or the whip. I thought only of Isaiah's face and the small, broken things that made up my life. The prick was small. It bled like any human wound, warm and startling and immediate. She flinched, but the motion was tiny, a blink under the vaudeville of civility they taught their kind. I dabbed the blood with the scrap of lace, folding it into a tight square, and I tucked it inside the scrap of cloth I had hidden in my apron. The brooch lay where it had been. No one noticed. The room hummed with music and conversation, and the mistress resumed her laughter, none the wiser that a single drop of her made a chain. After that, the blood became a map. I carried it to the edge of the slave quarters, and buried it shallowly beneath a flowering bush, where roots tangled and drank of the earth. Adeline had taught me how the ground does its own remembering. Bury a token where the soil was soft and the wind would pass, and the spirits who listened would find it. Around the scrap I buried, I scattered salt for binding and ash for forgetting. The ritual was simple in its tools, but complex in its demands: secrecy, timing, and a heart resolved. There are practicalities to this kind of work, materials to gather, precautions to take. I learned to keep my movements small and ordinary so my purpose remained invisible. I used the kitchen mortar to grind bitter herbs and sweet ones, careful to mark none of the containers. I tied little knots into threads and wrapped them in cloth to hide powders. I left simple offerings at the base of a certain live oak, cornmeal and sweetened milk for the spirits that guard thresholds. Each act was a small, ordinary thing to anyone watching, 1,000 tiny gestures that added up to a single defiant plan. Yet even with these precautions, the work felt like stepping out over a canyon with a rope tied to your waist and faith as the only promise. The blood had made a key. Keys open doors people believe are sealed, but keys can also attract attention. The darker part of me, the part that felt the edges of grief and anger, thrummed with the possibilities. If blood could bridge the mistress to the earth and the ancestors, could it also pull on the cords of her family, tug at the roots that nourished her kin? Could it make her taste the fear she had fed others? I reminded myself of the warnings. Adeline had never lied about cost. If you take blood, she had said, you must be ready for what answers. Remember, child, debts pay debts. Offerings ask for balance. Take what you ask for. I felt the warning press at the back of my neck, cold as a wind that comes before storm. I had no illusions about what I was about to invite, but my hands had already closed around the blade of necessity. If there was a price, I told myself, I would pay it. If the ancestors demanded a toll, I would carry it. Isaiah's voice in my memory demanded no less. After the token was buried, I returned to the kitchen as if nothing had happened. I washed pans, stirred stews, threaded needles. I smiled at the children as they hurried by. In the lullaby of ordinary tasks, the extraordinary felt impossible. The mistress sang the last notes of a hymn while the clock in the hall moved toward midnight. I slept little that night, and when I did, dreams braided with the smell of the earth and the metallic scent of blood. Adeline's voice threaded through, steady as tide. Now watch, now wait. The key had been made, the lock waited, and I, who had lived my life as property, held in my palms the first shape of a revolution that could not be measured in currency or counted in days. Moonlight is a lazy liar. It makes everything seem softer than it truly is. Under its wash, the swamp looks like silk and the paths like ribbons, but when you step into the marsh, the ground takes back its gentleness with teeth. I knew the landscape the way a seamstress knows fabric. Every seam, every tear, every place a hidden stitch might hold. The roots I needed did not grow in polite gardens or neat rows. They lived where things were wild and stubborn. in the swamp's belly where frogs sang like 1,000 broken clocks, and the air tasted of rot and green water. That's where power thinned and the world leaned closer to the other side. Adeline taught me to go where others feared to look. Power hides in the places the decent won't walk, she'd say, and spit twice into the dirt for emphasis. There are plants that bloom under sunlight, and plants that bloom under sorrow. There are roots that drink freely from morning dew, and roots that feed on the memory of blood. Those were the ones I sought. They were called by many names in hushed voices. Devil's breath, bloodweed, old woman's tongue. Names are soft, the thing itself was not. I waited until the household was sunk into the heavy sleep that follows late wine in a long story. The river road lay quiet, the distant dogs silenced by their owner's intoxication. I wrapped my feet in old cloth to muffle my steps and tied my hair up tight so it wouldn't snag on branches. Each movement was slow and precise, the way you move when life depends on it, because it did. The further I walked from the house, the more livid the night became. Crickets shrilled, and frogs answered in low bell tones. The smell of the swamp rose and fell like someone breathing close. The first root I found looked like the knotted finger of a drowned man, pale and twisted. Its skin peeled away in places, revealing a pulp that smelled faintly sweet and metallic, like iron left in rain. Adeline had shown me how to find them. Look for places where the earth seems to remember a wound, places where animals avoid. The root had a stubborn will, refusing to release its grip on the soil. I dug with a small trowel hidden under my skirts, my fingers slipping into mud until I felt the warmth of the root pulse against my palm. When I pulled it free, the dirt shook loose and clung to my wrists like superstition. Some roots wanted to be asked, and some wanted to be taken. For the ones that wanted asking, I sang. The song was a thing my grandmother had hummed in the bitter mornings, a small litany of names and offerings. The swamp listened. The roots seemed to shudder under my voice, as if deciding whether to trust me. When I wrapped a strip of cloth around the ones that answered and tied them off with a knot I'd learned in childhood, I felt a ripple run through me, like a promise clicked into place. Not all the collection was calm. In one hollow, a vine lashed at my arm, thorny fingers closing like a fist. I cursed under my breath, wordless and sharp. Pain is honest, it keeps you present. The thorn pierced skin and I bled, a thin line of red that surprised me with its brightness under the moon. It hurt, but the drop of blood on my palm tasted like decision. Some things require price up front. The wound would heal, but something in me had shifted with that exchange. The roots I sought liked such bargains. They respond to the salt of skin and the warmth of a heart beating too fast. I collected basil, bitter yarrow, and the small black bulbs that smelled of iron and old coins. Each had a use. Basil to steady, yarrow to bind, the iron bulbs to call memory. I wrapped them in linen and tucked them into the scrap of cloth where the mistress's blood lay. The bundle looked absurdly ordinary then, some ragged things tied up for no one's pity, but under moon and mud it was a promise in miniature, a talisman disguised as tidiness. On the way back, I paused by a willow whose roots drank from a slow-moving creek. The willow was old as the road, its branches whipping like sheaves of hair in the swamp wind. A weathered stone sat under its roots, half swallowed by moss. I knelt and placed my palm on the stone, feeling the cold draw down into my bones. The ancestors were not always loud. Sometimes they pressed through the small and steady things, the smell of wet stone or the way an old tree bent to shelter a path. I left an offering there, crumbled cornbread and a sip of the last of my water, and whispered the names I'd learned from Adeline. Guard us, I asked the earth. Hold what I set down and do not let it be found. The return to the quarters felt longer than my journey out. The air in the cabin smelled of sweat and lamp oil, and a child slept with her face pressed to her mother's neck, sucking air like a small bellows. In the dim light, I unwrapped the roots and spread them across the small table where we kept needles and thread. The scent was sharp, a perfume of dirt and iron, and for a moment I imagined each root as a finger reaching toward the mistress. It was a fanciful thought to give my hands something to do, but fantasy and labor are close cousins out here, both necessary to survive. Adeline had taught me to dry them slowly, to grind them with the back of a wooden spoon in the mortar we kept for herbs. Gentle, she always said. You want the medicine, not the killing of it. So I did as taught, slow, even strokes, listening to the herbs whisper as they gave up their power. I mixed them with salt and ash, and the iron bulbs I ground until they smelled of metal and rain. Each ingredient was measured by instinct, more than scale. A pinch here, a whisper there. The bundle began to hum under my fingers as if it had a heartbeat of its own. That night, while the plantation slept dreaming of sugar and sermons, I sat with my work by lamplight, stitching the scraps of root and blood into a small cloth charm. I embroidered a line into its edge, a line so small that no one would see it who wasn't told where to look. But it was a line that marked the blood's intent. The charm was not a weapon as anyone else would understand it. It was more a question posed to the world, and the world's reply. A threaded petition asking the soil to remember, the spirits to move, the mistresses of memory to take note. When dawn cracked the sky into pale and thirst, I hid the bundle beneath the floorboards where the light would never reach, a place the mistress walked over each day when she moved from bedroom to parlor. I placed a small stone over the gap to make it look natural. It had to be invisible to survive. The earth remembered where I had been. The roots hummed in the dark, quiet and patient. They waited, as I did, for the breach I had made with a single drop of blood to be answered. There is a particular silence that comes after a secret is sealed. It sits like a held breath and presses down on the ribs. I held it that morning as I walked back into the house, carrying a basket of linen like any other day. My hands steadied the cloth, but inside my chest the roots had reached further than I could know. Outside the world unfurled with ordinary cruelty. Inside something older and truer had begun to stir. There is a moment, just before midnight, when the world feels as if it holds its breath. The insects hush, the air stills, and the moon seems to lean lower, listening. That's the moment Adeline always spoke of. The boundary, the crossing, when what lies above and what lies below grow close enough to touch. She warned me, at midnight, the road forks. If you walk it with courage, you may find what you seek. If you walk it with fear, the road will take you instead. That night I was not brave, but I was resolved. Sometimes resolve wears the face of courage well enough to fool the dark. The crossroads lay beyond the last bend of the swamp path, where two dirt tracks met under a crooked oak. It was no place for decent folk, not even in daylight. The locals said spirits gathered there, trading secrets for songs and deals for flesh. I had never gone, not truly, though I had dreamed of it often, standing in my sleep at a place where the world split into 4 directions and something unseen waited to bargain. But this night I carried more than dreams. In the small bundle tied at my hip were the roots I had gathered, ground into powder and wrapped in linen, a small jar of salt mixed with ash, and the most precious of all, the mistress's blood, sealed into cloth like a heartbeat folded into silence. The moon was high when I reached the clearing. The oak stood with its branches stretched wide, like a crooked preacher pointing 4 ways at once. Its roots broke the dirt road, splitting the earth into jagged seams. The ground smelled of iron and damp clay. I knelt there, my knees pressed into the dust, and unpacked my bundle. First the salt. I poured it in a circle, careful and slow, my hand trembling though I forced it steady. A circle was protection, Adeline said. A way to mark your place, so the world outside couldn't swallow you whole. Next, the ash sprinkled across the circle's line to seal it. Then the roots laid in the center, each piece arranged like compass points. North for binding, south for calling, east for remembrance, west for vengeance. When the circle was set, I pulled the blood-soaked lace from its wrapping. Even dried, it still carried a faint copper scent, sharp enough to make my stomach twist. I laid it in the center of the roots, the heart of the working. My fingers lingered over it, and for the first time, I asked myself if this was truly what I wanted. Not justice. Justice was a thing owned by courts and laws that never spoke my name. Not forgiveness, that belonged to people who had the luxury of choice. What I wanted was something else entirely. I wanted her to feel haunted. I wanted her to know what it was to wake and not be alone in her skin. I wanted the echo of her cruelty to stretch further than she ever thought possible. The clock tower in the great house struck 12. Its chime carried over the fields, through the trees, a hollow sound that rang in my chest. Midnight. I began the chant. It was not English. It was not any tongue I could name. It was the song my grandmother had hummed when she crushed herbs, when she buried bones, when she called the wind to bend its path. The syllables rose like smoke, curling through my teeth, heavy and rough. My voice shook at first, but the more I sang, the more it steadied, until the sound seemed not to come from me at all, but from something deeper, something older, using my mouth as its vessel. The air thickened, the oak's branches rattled, though no wind stirred. The night grew heavy, pressing against my skin, and the shadows stretched long and strange, bending toward the circle. The powder of the roots shimmered faintly, like embers though no fire burned. I felt a weight in the earth shift, as though something beneath the soil had turned over and opened its eyes. Ancestors, I whispered, my voice cracking against the chant. I call you. I call you with blood, with root, with ash. I call you to see me, to hear me, to carry what I cannot. The ground trembled lightly. Almost like the purr of a beast, my breath caught. I pressed my palm against the blood-soaked lace and felt it pulse. Not like fabric, but like flesh. My heart thundered in answer. The air grew cold. Not the chill of night, but the cold of a door opening where no door should be. I knew then that I was not alone. A presence pressed in around me, heavy as water. It was not gentle, nor cruel. It was immense. It filled the crossroads like a shadow too large to name. I did not look up, for Adeline had warned, never look them full in the face. They show you what you ask, and sometimes what you cannot bear. So I kept my eyes on the circle, on the trembling lace, on the roots that pulsed faintly with borrowed light. My chant faltered, and in the silence that followed, another sound came, a whisper, low and layered, like 100 voices speaking through the throat of one. What do you seek? It asked. The words weren't in my ears, they were in my bones. My hands shook, but I steadied them against the earth. I seek retribution, I said. My voice cracked but held. I seek a curse that does not die with her breath. I seek a chain that binds her bloodline to despair, as she has bound mine. The presence stirred, the air rippled, and the oak's branches bent inward as if listening closer. Blood remembers, the whisper said. Yes, I whispered back. Blood remembers. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. A drop of blood seeped out and sank into the soil, and when it touched the earth, the ground hissed like a hot pan meeting water. I gasped, my hand flying to my chest. A pressure pressed against me from all sides, crushing and expansive, as if the world itself leaned down to look at me. I thought I might break under it, but I stayed kneeling, stayed steady, because this was the price. The whisper returned, curling around me like smoke. So be it. The air cracked. The circle shivered, and then, as sudden as a breath drawn and released, the weight lifted. The night returned to its ordinary hum, the insects, the frogs, the stillness of trees. But I knew nothing was ordinary anymore. The lace in the circle had crumbled into dust. The roots turned to ash, though no flame had touched them. Only the faint mark of the salt ring remained, glowing faintly before fading back into the dirt. My body shook as I stood, knees weak, heart wild. The crossroads looked unchanged, but I was not. Something had shifted in the fabric of the world. A door had been opened and a bargain had been struck. I gathered what was left, though there was little. I pressed my palm to the earth one last time, whispering thanks. Then I turned and walked back toward the cabins, the moon lighting my path. Behind me, the crossroads held its silence, but I knew the road was no longer empty. Something waited there now, unseen, walking in step with me. I returned from the crossroads with dirt on my hands and ash in my hair, but inside me burned something far stranger than exhaustion. The air itself seemed different as I crossed the fields back toward the cabins. Like every blade of grass bent toward me, like every shadow whispered. I tried to steady my breath, but my chest rattled with something too large for lungs to hold. The crossroads had answered me, that much was certain. Yet the ritual was not finished. The crossroads only opened the door. Now I had to step through it. For nights afterward, I prepared. By day I worked as though nothing had changed, carrying water, stirring pots, enduring the mistress's tongue lashing with bowed head. But each moment I was gathering, weaving, setting the stage for what came next. I collected candle stubs from the kitchens, charcoal from the fireplace, splinters of wood that had burned down to nothing, but still carried the ghost of flesh. I saved bits of string, broken buttons, cracked dishes. Small things, useless to anyone but me, each humming faintly with the weight of a life lived near it. Most important of all, I carried that emptiness where the lace had been. It was gone, crumbled into dust at the crossroads, but its absence throbbed in me like a phantom limb. The bond was made, the blood sealed into earth. All that remained was to call it fully into the world of flesh and bone. I chose the night of the new moon. Darkness would be my ally. No light to betray me, no shadow to give me away. The others in the cabins fell into uneasy sleep, but I lay awake, listening to the mistress's voice carried faintly on the night air, shrill and sharp as she quarreled with herself in her great house. She had grown restless in those days, her temper quick to flare, her eyes sunken, her hands trembling when she raised her cup. Whispers said she wandered the halls at night, muttering, seeing things no one else could. It had begun. When the hour neared, I slipped from my cot and moved to the edge of the woods. I carried a small clay bowl, stolen salt, the charcoal, and a candle stub. The bowl I filled with water from the creek, and into it I dropped a strand of my own hair and a sliver of fingernail. The curse must tie flesh to flesh, blood to blood. Without my offering, it would remain a shadow. With it, it would walk. I lit the candle, the flame small and unsteady, but enough. Around me the forest held its breath. The usual songs of crickets and frogs stilled, as if the night knew to keep silence. I placed the bowl in front of me and drew a circle in the dirt with the charcoal, pressing hard enough to break the black stick into fragments. With the pieces I drew sigils inside the circle, symbols Adeline had traced in the dirt when she thought no one watched. I had watched, I had remembered. Then I began to chant. It was not the same chant as the crossroads. This one was harsher, teeth against tongue, words that scraped the throat raw. My voice cracked, but I forced it onward, each syllable pulling something unseen closer. The candle sputtered, guttered, then flared twice as tall, its flame bending sideways though no wind stirred. The water in the bowl trembled. Ripples spread from the center outward though nothing touched it. My hair and nail floated on the surface, circling, drawn by an invisible current. Blood of my body, I whispered, slipping the blade of a small kitchen knife against my palm. A thin line of red welled up, warm and sharp. I let 3 drops fall into the bowl. The water hissed as if it boiled, though it remained cool to the touch. The ripples ceased, the surface stilled. Then slowly the water darkened. Not red, but black, a shadow spreading until the bowl looked like it held night itself. The chant grew louder, pouring from me as if I were hollow, and something else filled me with sound. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches stretching, their bark groaning like old bone. Shadows swayed at the edge of the circle, though my candle burned steady. The earth trembled faintly, not enough to knock me from my knees, but enough to make the bowl quiver in the dirt. Then the whisper came again, the same layered voice from the crossroads, curling through my ribs like smoke. Who calls? I swallowed, my mouth dry as ash. I do. Rosa, daughter of the bound, granddaughter of Adeline. What do you seek? I bowed my head over the bowl. To bind her, I said. My throat caught, but I pressed on. To bind her spirit to torment. To see her body fail and her bloodline wither. To make her name rot upon every tongue that speaks it. The whisper rustled like dead leaves. The price, the word cut cold. I had known there would be a price. Nothing walked from the crossroads without taking something in return. My hand tightened over my bleeding palm. Take of me what you must, I whispered. But leave enough that I may watch her fall. The air shifted. The trees groaned louder, roots pulling against the soil. The shadows at the edge of the circle pressed closer, but the salt and charcoal held. The water in the bowl boiled now, truly boiled, steaming though no fire touched it. And in that steam faces formed, shifting, flickering, mouths open in soundless screams. I bit my lip until I tasted iron. The whisper laughed, low and terrible. So be it. The candle snapped in two. The flame shot upward, white-hot, then extinguished, plunging me into darkness. Yet the bowl glowed faintly, the black water shimmering as though it held stars beneath its surface. The steam curled upward, drifting higher until it vanished into the branches above. When the silence settled, the bowl was still. The water clear again, my hair and nail floating as before. But I knew it was no longer water. It was a vessel now, a mirror, a doorway. I could feel it hum against my skin, a vibration low and deep. My body ached as though I had been struck. My chest burned, my head throbbed, and every breath felt borrowed. I staggered to my feet, the bowl in my hands, and whispered a single word of thanks, though whether to my ancestors or to the thing that had answered, I could not say. When I returned to the cabin, the candle stub was gone. The charcoal crumbled to dust. But the bowl I kept, hidden beneath my cot, covered with rags. Inside, the water remained calm. Yet when I peered into it, I did not see my reflection. I saw hers, the mistress, her pale face, her eyes wide and sleepless, her lips trembling as though she already felt the chains tightening. The invocation was complete. The curse had a body now, and soon it would walk. At first it was small, almost unnoticeable, the way sickness creeps on soft feet. The mistress woke with shadows under her eyes, her skin pale as wax. She paced the veranda before dawn, her slippers dragging, muttering about dreams she couldn't shake. By daylight she snapped at the servants with more venom than usual, as if their very breathing grated on her nerves. I watched with lowered eyes, head bowed, hands busy, but inside I was listening for the curse to stir, like a rattlesnake in dry grass. It did not take long. The first torment came in her sleep. She had always been a restless sleeper, but now the whole house rattled with her screams. At midnight she shrieked like a woman in labor, calling names that were not her own. The other slaves whispered she cried out for her mother, long dead. They said she clawed at the air as if drowning in water no one else could see. I heard her too, From the cabin the sound carried clear, a ragged voice breaking through the stillness of the night. I lay awake, the bowl hidden beneath my cot, my breath shallow. Every scream was a knot in the rope I had tied around her soul. Every sob was proof the curse had teeth. By day she trembled with fatigue, but the torment did not ease. At her vanity she found scratches across her arms and shoulders, red welts that no nail or branch could explain. She stared at them in the mirror, eyes wide, lips parted, as if the reflection might confess what her mind could not grasp. She tried to hide it, but the housekeeper saw, and the overseer, and the field hands too. Rumors spread like wildfire. The mistress was haunted. The mistress was cursed. Some said she walked too close to the graveyard at night, and something followed her home. Others whispered she had turned to cruelty not only on us, but on God himself, and now she reaped what she had sown. I said nothing. Silence is its own kind of power. Still she grew suspicious. Her sharp eyes darted from face to face, hunting for the one who had cursed her. Once she seized me by the arm so hard my skin bruised, hissing that she knew I was too quiet, too calm. I lowered my gaze and said, "Yes, ma'am," my voice smooth as still water. She released me, but not before her hand trembled, as though fear had made her bones weak. The torment deepened with each passing night. She refused to sleep alone, demanding her maids keep candles burning until dawn. Yet even with light and company, her dreams turned rancid. She saw insects crawling over her skin, tasted ash on her tongue, heard the cries of infants in the walls. One maid swore she found the mistress standing before a mirror at midnight, laughing at her own reflection, though her eyes were wide and wild. The house began to sour under her unraveling. Servants fled their posts, unable to endure her fit. Her husband had long since passed, but she muttered his name as if he lingered behind her shoulder, unseen but near enough to mock her. I did not need the bowl to see her unravel, but sometimes when the others slept, I lifted the rag and peered into the black water. Always she appeared there, eyes red, lips cracked, skin clammy with sweat. Sometimes she wept, sometimes she raged. Once she stared into the bowl so directly that I dropped it, heart hammering, sure she had seen me. But when I looked again, she was only screaming into her empty room. The first torment was not meant to kill her. Not yet. No, the curse had patience. It gnawed at her slowly, stripping her strength, hollowing her spirit. What good is vengeance if it ends too swiftly? Better to let it rot her from within, one dream, one breath, one thought at a time. The others began to avoid her. Even her kin who came to visit left quickly, unsettled by her stares, her muttering, her trembling hand. They whispered in the parlor that she was unwell, that perhaps a physician should be summoned. But no doctor's medicine could cure what walked in her blood now. One evening as I cleared the kitchen hearth, I heard her shrieking from upstairs. The sound carried sharp as a blade, high-pitched, breaking into sobs. Then silence. Then a crash, as though a mirror had been struck. My heart raced, and though I longed to run to see, I kept my steps slow, careful, steady. Slaves do not rush toward the cries of their mistress unless invited. That is the law. But later, when I brought water to her chambers, I saw. The mirror was shattered, shards glittering across the rug. She sat in the corner, knees drawn to her chest, rocking. Her lips moved, but no words came out, only a whisper like dry leaves scraping. Her maid stood frozen, unsure whether to comfort her or flee. When she raised her head, her eyes found mine. For a heartbeat, I thought she knew, truly knew. A cold smile crept over her face, twisted and broken, and she whispered, "I see you." My blood ran ice, though I kept my face still. I set the water on the table and bowed low. "Yes, ma'am," I said, and left the room without looking back. But all night I lay awake, her words echoing in my mind. Did she see me through the bowl, through the circle, through the bargain I had struck at the crossroads? Or was it only madness, the curse biting deeper into her flesh? The first torment had done its work. She was unraveling piece by piece, and though fear gnawed at my own belly, I could not turn back. The curse had been set in motion. It would not stop until her bloodline itself lay in ruin, and this was only the beginning. A curse does not stay where you plant it. Like water poured on soil, it seeps, it spreads, it finds its way into every crack. By the time the mistress began her second month of torment, it was no longer only her body or her dreams that carried the weight of my invocation. The whole house began to wither with her. At first the signs were small. The milk soured faster than it should, curdling before it touched the pot. Bread dough refused to rise no matter how much yeast the cook stirred into. The candles smoked black, their flames choking the air until the maids coughed. The mistress cursed her staff for incompetence, yet no amount of care or effort could keep the rot at bay. The walls themselves began to whisper. The boards swelled with damp, though no rain had fallen. Plaster cracked and peeled in curling strips, and a smell of mildew clung to the parlor, as though the river had crept inside to drown the rug. The servants scrubbed and scrubbed, their hands raw, but the stench returned within hours, stronger each time. One night a crash shook the house. A portrait of the mistress's father, hung high in the dining hall, had torn free of its nail and fallen. The canvas split down the middle, slicing his painted face in two. No one could explain how the hook gave way. When they tried to hang it again, the frame warped, refusing to sit straight. After that, the mistress ordered the portrait burned. The livestock fared no better. Chickens laid eggs with blood in their yolks. A cow birthed a stillborn calf, its body twisted, its eyes clouded as if it had drowned in the womb. Horses shied from the stables, refusing to enter, their nostrils flaring at something unseen. The overseer called it bad luck, but the hands whispered what I already knew. The land itself was sick, and the mistress, she grew worse with it. Her voice carried through the house in ragged cries, calling for servants who had fled, shrieking at ghosts only she could see. I heard her one evening, standing in the front hall, her hair unpinned, her gown hanging loose, wailing at the staircase as though someone stood there mocking her. Her face contorted with grief, her hands clawing at the air, and when she collapsed onto the floor, the house echoed with a sound like a body falling into a grave. I should have felt triumph. This was what I had asked for, what I had summoned. Yet the deeper the rot crept, the heavier my chest became. The house was not only hers. It was where we all lived, where children slept, where weary bodies returned after long days in the field. When the roof groaned in the night, when vermin scurried bold across the floor, when water in the pails turned cloudy without reason, we all suffered. The others began to whisper my name, not openly, not with accusation, but in cautious tones, as though I had become another shadow in the corners. Some said I walked with spirits. Some said I had struck a bargain, that the mistress's madness was tied to my silence. When they passed me, they lowered their gaze, not out of pity anymore, but fear. Still I pressed on. The bowl beneath my cot showed me the truth. When I gazed into its water, I no longer saw just the mistress's face, but the house itself, sagging, darkening, splitting at its seams. Rooms that once gleamed with polished wood now appeared in ruin, as though the future had bled backward into the present. I knew then that the curse was doing more than haunting her body. It was rewriting the place where she held power, poisoning her legacy brick by brick. One afternoon, a storm rolled in without warning. The sky blackened, thunder cracked, and rain fell heavy as if the heavens had been split open. But when we ran to close the shutters, we found the windows already broken, shards scattered across the floor. The rain poured in unchecked, soaking curtains, warping the floorboards. The mistress stood in the center of her room, arms lifted, laughing as if she had summoned the storm herself. That night, the housekeeper quit. She fled down the road with nothing but a sack on her back, muttering prayers as though outrunning the devil. Others followed in the days to come. One by one they vanished, leaving the halls echoing and empty save for the mistress's shrieks. She demanded new staff, but few dared enter a house spoken of in whispers as cursed ground. It was not only the house. The fields yielded poorly, stalks of corn bending weak, cotton buds grey and brittle. The overseer cursed the soil, swore the land had gone barren, but I knew better. It was not the land that failed. It was the blood that claimed it. I remember one evening walking past the veranda with a bucket of water. The mistress sat slumped in a rocking chair, her eyes hollow, her hands twitching against her lap. She stared out at the fields with a gaze so empty it chilled me. Then slowly she began to rock, the chair creaking, her lips moving. No sound came at first, only the shape of words. Then faintly a hiss, wrought with me. The bucket slipped from my hand, water splashing against the ground. She did not turn her head, did not acknowledge me. She only kept rocking, whispering that same phrase again and again. From that night forward, the house never felt still. Doors slammed when no one touched them, windows cracked with no hand to strike. The very air buzzed with something restless, like bees trapped in walls. The rot had teeth now, chewing through wood, through plaster, through memory. The mistress was no longer just a woman haunted. She was the heart of a sickness that pulsed outward, infecting everything she touched. And as the curse deepened, I began to wonder if I had tethered not only her, but myself as well. For when I lay in bed at night, I too heard the house groan. I too smelled the mildew I too felt the shadows press close, as though eager to claim not just her, but all who dwell beneath her roof. And yet I did not falter, because rot has a purpose. It clears the ground. It makes way for something new. The mistress would not know peace, nor would her house, nor her name. That was the bargain, that was the price. The house was crumbling, but the curse did not stop at its walls. What I had called into being was not bound by brick or wood. It traveled on the blood it was tied to, winding its way like roots beneath the soil, reaching for every vein that carried her family's name. The first sign came with a letter. It arrived one morning, carried by a pale young courier who looked uneasy, just stepping onto the veranda. His eyes darted about as though the air itself carried a sickness. The mistress snatched the envelope from his hand, tore it open with trembling fingers, and scanned the page. I was nearby polishing silver, and I saw the color drain from her cheek. She clutched the letter to her chest and let out a sound that was neither sob nor scream, but something jagged between. Word spread quickly. Her sister in Georgia had taken ill. No physician could explain the fevers that left her raving, the sudden loss of hair, the sores blooming across her body. She withered in weeks, her health rotting as if her flesh remembered sins she never confessed. The mistress raged at the news. She called it gossip meant to wound her. She accused her kin of weakness, of lies, of melodrama. But when a second letter came, this one from Charleston, her face blanched again. Another cousin dead of strange fits, her body found twisted on the parlor floor, eyes wide as though she had seen something claw its way out of the shadows. By then, whispers spread faster than the ink on the pages. The family line was cursed. Wherever the blood ran, misfortune followed. More letters arrived. A nephew drowned in calm water, though he was said to be an excellent swimmer. A niece miscarried her child, the third in a row. Each babe born silent, their tiny hands curled as though clutching some invisible chain. A brother's house caught fire in the night, the flames licking up so fast no bucket could quench them, leaving only charred beams and the stench of smoke. He lived, but he wandered afterward like a man hollowed out, muttering prayers until his voice cracked. The mistress began pacing day and night, clutching each letter to her breast, as though she could hold her kin together with her trembling hands. But the more she read, the more frantic she became. She accused servants of poisoning the ink, of forging disasters to torment her. She burned 2 letters in the hearth before they could be read aloud. But even ash could not hide their truth. I watched silent as the weight of it crushed her. Every death, every illness, every misfortune was a stone added to her shoulders. Yet no matter how she staggered beneath it, I knew the curse would not relent, because I had not asked for her alone to suffer. I had asked for her bloodline to feel what mine had carried for generations, the lash, the hunger, the despair that did not die but passed from parent to child like a birthright of chains. And so her kin began to taste it. The overseer, a man who once strutted with certainty, began crossing himself whenever he saw her. He said it plain, "Ma'am, your family is touched." The mistress struck him across the face, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, the knowledge she could not deny. The land itself echoed the curse. Crops blackened in the field before ripening, their roots eaten by worms that multiplied beyond reason. Crows gathered in numbers so great the sky darkened, their wings a storm of black feathers. They perched on the roof, on the fences, on the very sills of her windows, staring with eyes like polished stones. She drove them away with shouts and thrown candlesticks, but they always returned. The slaves whispered prayers when the birds came. Some buried charms near their doors, hoping to keep the sickness from crossing their thresholds. I did not tell them the truth, that the curse had no boundary, no fence, no wall. It traveled where blood carried it, and blood flowed far. One evening, the mistress summoned a preacher. He came armed with a Bible thick as a brick, and a voice full of thunder. He strode through the house sprinkling water, shouting verses into every corner. His prayers clashed with the buzzing of flies that had begun to gather in the parlor, thick clouds that no swatter could thin. The mistress knelt, sobbing, as he pressed his palm to her forehead and demanded the devil leave her blood. But the flies only swarmed thicker, crawling across the pages of his Bible, until he snapped it shut and fled the house. He did not return. After that, no one came. No preacher, no physician, no kin. Her letters went unanswered, her pleas scattered like seeds on barren soil. She was alone in her grand house, left to rock and mutter, her line rotting branch by branch. I should have felt triumph. And yes, some nights I lay awake with a thin smile on my lips, listening to her footsteps pace frantic circles, imagining her kin choking on the same dread. But there were other nights when the weight of it pressed cold against me, because sometimes when I looked into the bowl, I saw more than her face. I saw strangers, women and men I had never met, writhing in sickness, clutching their bellies, staring into the dark with terror I recognized. I had not known their names before the curse, but now their faces lived in me, etched as deep as scars. The bloodline was unraveling, fracturing, splintering like a tree struck by lightning, the cracks spreading from root to branch until every limb trembled with rot. And still, the curse had not reached its end. For a line does not fall quietly. It drags itself down, kicking, screaming, clawing at the dirt. And when it falls, it does not fall alone. For the first time in years, I knew the taste of quiet. The lash no longer sang across my back. The mistress, too consumed by her own torment, had forgotten her cruelties. Days passed when she barely noticed me. Her eyes were fixed always on shadows, on letters, on dreams that ripped her sleep to tatters. The whip hung idle on its hook, gathering dust like an old memory. I moved through the house as though wrapped in a cloak of smoke. She saw me, but she did not see me. She gave orders, but her voice trembled, hollow with fear. I carried out her commands with bowed head, but inside I walked with my spine straight, my steps firm. For once the air did not crush me. For once my body was not simply flesh to be beaten, but flesh that carried power. Yet peace is a fragile thing. At night I lay awake, listening to the chorus of the curse. It sang from the mistress's chambers in broken sobs. It echoed in the fields where crops withered to husks. It whispered in the rustle of crows' wings, in the frantic whinnies of horses that refused their reins. The land itself moaned beneath the weight of vengeance, and though my heart swelled with justice, a shadow grew beside it. I had asked for retribution, and it was given. But vengeance is no gentle visitor. It does not knock politely. It tears open doors and floods every room, seeping into cracks, drowning everything in its path. And I began to wonder, had I asked for too much? The faces haunted me most. Each time I lifted the rag from the bowl, I saw them, kin of the mistress, strangers to me, yet tied by blood to the cruelty I had endured. Their suffering unfolded in the dark water like a stage play I could not look away from. A woman gasping for breath as fever claimed her. A child twisting in night terrors, his small body drenched in sweat. A man clutching his chest, eyes wide with terror as his heart beat its last. They had not struck me, they had not held the lash, yet their blood carried the same mark, and so they paid the price. Some nights I told myself it was fair, that every lash laid on my back had been born of the wealth of that bloodline, that their comfort was woven from our pain. If the roots of the tree were poisoned, then every branch deserved to wither. But other nights, when the moon was high and the wind hissed through the pines, I thought of their children, babies who had never drawn breath, little ones who never had the chance to grow teeth, let alone wield cruelty. Were their cries part of justice, or had my curse become something wilder, something that devoured without care? I remembered the crossroads, the man who met me there, cloaked in shadow, his smile sharp as a blade. His voice still lingered. A price paid is a price shared. Had I shared more than I meant to? Still, when I woke with the sun and walked past the mistress's chamber, I felt the fire in me burn brighter. For all my doubts, the sight of her trembling hands, her hollow cheeks, her hair falling loose in patches, these reminded me why I had done it. She who once towered like a storm over my life now cowered before every creak of the floorboards. She who once raised her hand against me now clutched her rosary so tightly her knuckles cracked. I had turned the balance that could not be undone. The other slaves began to notice. They whispered when I passed, voices tinged with awe and fear. Some called me blessed, others called me dangerous. A few avoided my gaze altogether, as though they feared my eyes might carry the same curse that had gutted the mistress. One woman pressed a charm of braided straw into my hand, begging me not to turn my wrath toward her children. I wanted to tell her I would never harm them, but the truth caught in my throat, because even I did not know the reach of what I had unleashed. Peace is a shadow when it is born from vengeance. It follows you, clings to you, but it is never whole. One night I dreamt of my mother. She was standing in the fields, her back straight, her head high. She smiled at me, but her eyes were wet with sorrow. "Child," she said, "you have broken the chain, but be careful the pieces do not cut your hands." I woke with tears on my cheeks, my chest heavy as stone. I turned my face toward the window where the moonlight spilled in. The air was thick with the cawing of crows, their wings blotting out the stars. I wondered then if they were messengers, or wardens, or simply scavengers waiting for the carcass of a family line to fall still. The days stretched long, and the mistress shrank further into her madness. She screamed less now, not because she had found peace, but because her voice had worn thin, a thread fraying with each hour. She muttered to herself in low tones, scratching her arms until they bled, staring at corners where nothing stood. The house smelled of rot, not from her flesh, not yet, but from the spirit that was dying in her. The walls groaned. The candles burned low even when freshly lit. The air was heavy with something unseen but felt in every breath. And through it all I carried my shadowed peace. I had struck the blow no whip could erase. I had carved vengeance into the marrow of a bloodline. And though my soul sometimes quivered with doubt, I would not, could not, turn back. Because peace, even shadowed, was more than I had ever been given. And I would hold it, even if it cut me. The house no longer breathed. It groaned, it creaked, it whispered in the dark. The air inside had turned heavy as damp cloth, pressing down on every chest, choking every breath. Even the bravest servant would not linger in its halls after dusk. They claimed they heard footsteps where no one walked, voices murmuring from empty rooms, the sound of weeping that had no body to weep it. And at the center of it all was the mistress. Her body, once proud, had withered to a husk. Her gowns, once rich with lace and pearls, hung loose on her frame like shrouds. Her skin carried the pallor of candle wax, her lips cracked, her hair fallen in clumps. Yet worse than her body was her mind. She had slipped from madness into something deeper, something not entirely of this earth. She no longer screamed. She chanted. Hours at a time her voice droned in low tones, stringing together words that belonged to no language I knew. Sometimes she muttered to the walls, as if bartering with spirits only she could see. Other times she laughed softly, the sound chilling as a lullaby sung at a grave. The servants avoided her, crossing themselves when she passed. One by one they began to vanish. Some fled into the night, unwilling to risk another day under her roof. Others disappeared without trace, as if the house itself had swallowed them whole. Their beds were found neatly made, their tools abandoned mid-task, their names never spoken again. I remained, not because I did not fear. Fear lived in my marrow now, pulsing with every beat of my heart. But I could not turn away. I had summoned this ruin, and I would see it through to its end. The letters ceased. Whether her kin had all fallen or simply chosen silence, we could not know. But I felt it deep in my bones. The curse had reached its roots into every corner of her lineage. The blood that once strutted with pride now curdled with misfortune. A line that had thrived on the labor of my people now staggered toward extinction. One evening I found her in the parlor. She sat before the cracked mirror, her eyes sunken, her fingers raw from scratching. Around her lay scraps of paper, scrawled with symbols and drawings I could not decipher. The air smelled of iron, and when I looked closer, I saw her fingertips stained dark, ink mixed with blood. She turned slowly toward me, and for a moment I thought I faced a corpse. But her eyes flickered with a fevered light, and she rasped, "It is you, isn't it?" I kept my gaze lowered. "Ma'am, you," she hissed, voice breaking like brittle glass. "You brought this. You carry it in your eyes. You've damned us all." Her words struck like stones. For a heartbeat I could not breathe. Then I steadied myself, bowing my head deeper. "Yes, ma'am," I said, my voice a whisper. She let out a sound, half laugh, half sob, and clutched her chest. "Then finish it," she cried. "If you have brought the knife to my throat, don't leave me waiting for the cut." Her plea haunted me. For nights after, I dreamed of her face, hollow and broken, begging for the mercy of death. But the curse was not mercy. It was not mine to end swiftly. It belonged to every lash, every scream, every drop of blood spilled before me. And vengeance, once called, chooses its own pace. The descent grew darker still. Storms rolled in without warning, black clouds boiling over the plantation. Rain hammered the earth, but it was no blessing. It turned the soil to muck, drowned the crops, warped the very wood of the house. Thunder rattled the windows, and lightning split trees in half, as though heaven itself sought to strike her dwelling down. Inside, the mistress spoke less and less. She sat in silence for hours, eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. When she did speak, her words made no sense. The chains are in the walls, the children are crying from the well, the blood won't wash off. Her voice grew faint, as though each word cost more than her body could afford. And then came the night of the final descent. I woke to a sound that froze my veins, the tolling of the great church bell. But no one had touched its rope. Still it rang, deep and mournful, echoing across the plantation. Each toll rattled the glass in the windows, each note heavier than stone. I lit a candle and crept to the mistress's chamber. The door stood ajar, the air inside thick with the stench of rot. She was there, kneeling on the floor, her body bent forward, her hands pressed into the wood. Her lips moved, whispering words too faint to hear. On the floor before her lay the bowl. My bowl! I had hidden it beneath my cot, wrapped tight in rags. But here it was, placed in the center of her chamber. The water inside was black as tar, rippling though no hand touched it. Her head lifted slowly and our eyes met. For the first time I felt her truly see me. Not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as the hand that had drawn her into ruin. "Take it," she whispered. Her voice cracked, blood trickling from her mouth. "Take it back, but curses do not return, they devour." The candle flickered, then died. Darkness swallowed the room. I heard her body collapse, a dull thud against the floor, and when lightning flashed through the window, I saw her sprawled there, her face twisted, her eyes wide open yet empty. The mistress was gone, but the curse was not. I felt it hum in the air, alive, restless. It was not satisfied with one life. It had bound itself to a name, to a bloodline, and it would follow that thread until the last drop was drained. I stood in the silence, the storm raging outside, and I understood. The final descent was not hers alone. It was a descent that would echo through generations. The mistress's body was laid in the ground before sunrise. There was no procession, no kin to mourn her, no neighbors to gather in solemn prayer. Only a shallow grave behind the churchyard, dug by trembling hands who muttered that she was better off beneath the soil than haunting the halls above it. The house fell silent. Yet silence is not peace. It was the silence of a storm that has broken everything in its path and now waits, heavy, for the next strike. For though her body rotted in the earth, the curse still walked. I felt it in the marrow of the air. At night, the crows still circled, blotting out the moon. The soil still soured beneath our feet. The bowl cracked now, hummed with a faint pulse when I touched it, as though some heart still beat within its black water. And beyond the plantation, whispers spread. Word traveled faster than horse or ship. The family was ruined. Kin scattered across Georgia, Carolina, Virginia, Louisiana. All fell to strange misfortunes. Some vanished without trace, their names never written again. Some wasted away in sick beds, their bodies covered in sores no physician could cure. Some went mad, clawing at their own flesh until they bled. The bloodline fractured and scattered, but the curse followed every drop. Years passed and still I heard the story. A child born in Charleston who never spoke a word before her sudden death. A man in Savannah who drowned in a dry well, lungs full of mud though no water lay within. A woman in New Orleans who set her own house aflame, screaming that shadows in the rafters had commanded her to burn. Each tale found its way back to me, carried by travelers, by whispers, by letters smuggled among the enslaved who passed news like contraband. Each tale confirmed what I already knew. The curse was tireless. It did not sleep, but did not forgive. And yet I lived. I bore no chains now. Time, war, and death loosened the yoke from my shoulders. Freedom came at last, though not as a gift, but as a price wrung from blood and fire. I walked away from the ruins of that house, carrying little but the memory of what I had done. Still, freedom did not unmake the shadow that clung to me. I had bound myself to vengeance, and vengeance leaves scars that even time cannot wash clean. Some nights I woke gasping, the sound of the mistress's voice clawing at my ears. Other nights I dreamed of kin I had never met, faces twisted in fear, hands reaching out as if begging me to call the curse away. I could not. The bargain was sealed, the debt written in a language older than the soil. I told myself it was just that the whip, the hunger, the chains, the screams, they demanded repayment, and perhaps they were repaid. But justice is not the same as peace. I lived longer than I had expected, long enough to see fields where I once bled tilled by new hands, long enough to see children run where chains once clattered. But wherever I went, I carried the knowledge of what I had set loose. I spoke little of it, but whispers travel even when tongues are still. Children gathered at firesides told stories of the cursed mistress of Mississippi, whose cruelty called down wrath upon her kin. They spoke of a slave woman who struck a bargain at the crossroads, who tied a bloodline to ruin. Some feared her, some praised her. Some wondered if she still walked, ageless, in the shadows of the pines. I never told them my name, because the curse was not mine alone. It had grown beyond me, a river overflowing its banks, carving new paths through the earth. And if my name were tied to it, then perhaps the curse would turn back on me and mine. Yet even in silence, I knew the truth. I had changed something permanent. The bloodline of my mistress would never rise again. They would scatter, dwindle, vanish into the dust of forgotten graves. Their wealth would rot, their houses collapse, their names fade from memory. And even if some branch of the tree survived, the curse would find it, coil around it, and squeeze until the last leaf fell. Because vengeance once sown is not easily uprooted. Even now, when the night grows too quiet, I hear the echo of the church bell tolling. Even now, when the wind stirs the trees, I see the crows take flight in black clouds, their wings blotting out the stars. Even now, when I look into still water, I half expect to see her face staring back at me, eyes wide, lips cracked, whispering, "Take it back," but there is no taking back, only moving forward. And so I walk with the shadow of what I called, knowing it will outlive me, knowing it will outlive the children of my children, knowing that some stories do not end. They only change shape. This is the legacy I leave behind. Not of chains, not of but of a curse that bled into the marrow of those who believe themselves untouchable. May the earth remember. May the blood remember. May the curse never rest.